live streaming world. We have folks that are working in the print world. We have folks that are working in the radio world. We have folks that are working in the podcast world. And I think all of these incredible artists sometimes mix and match their tool sets to tell the story in the best way possible. What we'll do first is, when we have a group like this, I really like to have each of them introduce themselves because they have such eclectic backgrounds. I think it's really beneficial for you to all hear all the extraordinary work that they're doing. So we're actually going to start first with just introductions and some background about the incredible work that's happening up here. And then we'll dive deeper into the conversation about community created content.
Hi, my name is Sabrina Horton, and I am the editor for the High Plains Reader, which is an art and entertainment publication based out of Fargo. We started as a weekly, now we're monthly. Thanks, Gomez. I guess my background is in print journalism. I was also editor for the Ashley Tribune, which started out in the wilds of German Russian country, South Central North Dakota. I guess I started out as a blogger, so a blogger and photographer.
Hello everyone, my name is Cindy Azucena Gomez-Schempp, and I was transplanted from Iowa by way of Houston, Texas, Harris County. That's where I was born. But I did grow up a part of my life in Mexico, and so I bring the perspective of a Mexican that has lived on both sides of the border and has been watching a lot of negative things happen in the United States that have just recently happened in Mexico. And also watching how the consolidation of media and the shifting of the control of platforms, of what people can say, especially what Black, Indigenous, people of color can say in media, change to the degree that mainstream media is really no longer relevant to most people's lives, where 60% of our young people are getting their information off of TikTok, their media information off of TikTok, and where our local news is a week behind Twitter, right? So I have been watching the transformation and been preparing for how local people, especially marginalized voices, can still be represented in media and proliferate media, the new media that is coming up, so we have a firm foothold and representation in the media locally.
My name is Nemo Siqueiros. I am a queer artist, they pronouns. I do video, audio engineering, editing at KPP Radio, and I am an aspiring animator and artist. So what I want to do with my work related to all of those skills that I have is to create ways for people to be able to tell their own stories through filmmaking and animation. And what I'm seeing so far with all of this media mergers and everything is, for example, the merger of HBO and Warner Brothers Discovery is that animators who work in the industry, we're seeing their work wiped off of the streaming services with no way for fans of their work to be able to purchase DVD sets or merch to support those shows, rendering them lost media inaccessible to the public. And as an artist and many other artists, we want to make sure that our work is available to the public to spread our stories and messages. And so by having independent artists put together with me, I'm hoping that we can start to tell our own stories in a way that is publicly available and can't be removed, at the whim of companies.
Hello, my name is Nico Georgiadis. I'm co-founder of Unicorn Ride. Unicorn Ride is a 501c3 nonprofit independent media organization that focus on a wide variety of different media outlets. We live stream, we do articles, investigations. We have a huge database of white supremacist organizers, chats from Unite the Right to right into this year with Patriot Front. Just try to also bring the community's voice out. Basically, our mission is to bring content to social and environmental struggles and to spotlight and exemplify community stories from the front line. One instance, North Dakota, during DAPL, Uniform Riot was embedded into the camps, basically live streamed a lot, filmed a lot, created a documentary called Black State Killers, A No DAPL Story, 2-hour feature length. That's our only feature length documentary, but we also have other documentaries during the George Floyd uprising 2 years ago in Minneapolis, where I live. There was a lot going on, really intense time. We live streamed a lot. We also put out a couple small mini documentaries called Report and Reflection. And you can find all our work at uniformriot.com.
And the way I manage my panels is pretty interactive. I'll come to you, the audience, in a second to see if you have a question. And with the panel, we can jump back and forth. Please don't feel obligated to answer every question. If you feel that it's been answered completely, or if you don't have anything more to share. But from your perspectives, and this is an open question for the entire panel, Nemo started this conversation about what they see as some of the challenges of consolidation. What else are you all seeing that is problematic of this centralization of storytelling and content?
One of the things that was the focus of our station is dealing with the aftermath of consolidation. Because consolidation didn't happen in a short period of time. It's been happening for the past decade or longer, actually. And for those of us who have been boots on the ground, organizing, my background is as a paralegal, working with people with disabilities, workers' compensation, workers' rights, discrimination issues, etc. And I found that the most, as an organizer, as a paralegal, I found that the partnership with media was crucial in order for those people to receive justice. As a paralegal, I also knew that the wheels of justice churn very, very slowly. And for people of color, not at all. Not at all. So, justice delayed is justice denied. And I felt that without a strong partnership with media, marginalized voices would not be heard. And as the consolidation of media continued to crunch our newsrooms down to nothing, where you didn't even have reporters on certain beats covering who was in local politics, how much they were getting paid, what was going on at the police department, what's going on at the school, where you don't actually have anybody running those beats or covering those stories anymore because the newsroom doesn't have the funding. And then it's left up to local people who care to make up for that failure in our local media, in our news and our radio and our print media. And as an organizer, I also realized that our mainstream media, whether it's at the local, the state, or even the national level, is compromised. I won't say bought and purchased, but that's what I mean. Because they're beholden to their sponsors. I was just mentioning to Sabrina that before, when I was editor at the High Plains Reader, we had people out in the Bakken in western North Dakota begging a weekly newspaper in Fargo, North Dakota, to cover the issues of displacement of people because of the fracking that was going on there, transportations, deaths, all of these issues, work-related issues, weren't being covered in the media because nobody, including our local newspapers, were ready to put the oil companies on the spot. So that's what happens. What happens is that stories that need to be covered about what's happening in your local, state, local, police department, hospitals, schools, it doesn't get covered. It gets swept under the rug. It gets omitted. There was 2 goals in starting a local non-commercial radio station for us. It was to give a platform to the community that wasn't beholden to advertisers, that somebody from an oil company or somebody from a large corporation or somebody with political backing couldn't come and say, we're going to pull all of our advertising so that your media platform is strangled to death. And we also learned that BIPOC people, through the trainings that we did to teach people how to film the police in public, film public meetings, school board, county commission, etc., is that you, as a local journalist, as a person trying to fill that gap because of media consolidation, will not be welcome. You will not be welcomed by the mainstream media, you will not be welcomed by local law enforcement, and you will not be welcomed by local institutions to do that coverage, to fill that void. And so what you are going to be doing is guerrilla journalism. As local community members, we are all going to be relegated to covering our own stories and to being multi-purpose journalists. You can no longer just be a print journalist or a local community blogger. You have to be able to shoot your own photographs, light your own blog, and you have to be able to edit and upload your own content. So, in order to maintain some semblance of the fourth institution of this country, which is free speech and media, right? We wanted to have local non-commercial media platforms that gave people media justice, especially marginalized voices, in a way that the local media can no longer do, national or state.
Yes. I wanted to add on that something that I'm seeing in relation to this conversation that I've now started is that something that is so unfortunate is that I will see creators for animated programs try to work in diversity representation, and as soon as it gets into queer territory, where there's more portrayals of queer characters or queer marriages, that's when the executives decide that, okay, well, we're going to now cut this program short for whatever reason they say, and usually it's not related to the queer character representation, but that's generally what it is. I've seen it with this program called Steven Universe, where 2 characters in a fan-representing figures decided to get married. And then after that, fans of the show felt like this was rushed. Why did it end like this? And now why are we getting like a separate series to tie up these loose ends? Well, because oftentimes the issue is that these companies are selling this show to other countries where there's homophobia, and they either need to censor heavily or completely have it unable to air because they don't want people in their countries to see queer people. So then the writers have to scramble to rewrite their ending for a show that they wanted to tell a certain way, and then fans are just left confused about what happened to the characters' arcs and story, and then they only see the flaws and not the struggles that they did to fight to put in that representation in the first place. And then we have buyer's remorse or whatever, where Disney, for example, was airing The Outhouse, and after the 2nd season, the executives decided that this doesn't fit our brand. Even though they have many shows that are about witches and wizards and all this magic stuff, but the issue is the main characters are queer. And it was only after they started launching the marketing for the 3rd season, which was now squeezed into 3-hour-long episodes, they saw the views on YouTube and realized that all the talk on Twitter every week with their release of episodes meant people actually liked it. For some reason, executives are not able to see modern day social media match up with the viewership of YouTube, but it's all connected. So now we have this artist and animators who knew all along that this show was good because they hear from their fans all the time. They see it expressed in fans cosplay, costuming their characters, writing stories about their characters that they really like, or making art about their favorite characters. And so when you take that away, you kind of leave all these fans feeling like, so every time I'm seen in media, I have to be hidden away. And so it's really what I'm trying to do is that I want people to tell their stories uncensored, unedited, and then when it's freely accessible, finding every which way that everyone can have access to it, so that there are some ways to get it in their country, and they can watch and see for themselves and figure out how they feel about it.
How media is being censored or degraded, but in total, especially since the last administration came into power, media has been targeted as an enemy of the state, where, previous presidencies considered the media the fourth estate, a check and a balance against our institutions of government. And now, and steadily, nobody trusts media. And just to pair a little bit of what independent new media goes through, we are fighting against a system that has been largely male-dominated, largely white male-dominated, and owned. And so the voices of everyone else have kind of been kept out or controlled in those arenas, whether they're female voices or whether they're people of color voices. And we're at a time now in our history when the new generation, they're just not going to stand for it. They will go elsewhere to get their information if you will not reflect the reality of their lives right now. By saying that nobody prepares journalists in order to deal with the new media landscape that we're in. When I was the editor of the High Plains Reader, I was going and doing trainings at all 3 universities here. And one of the first things that I told the journalist students is that they needed to push back. One of the reporters I sent out to do a report on tasing, local tasing. What I wanted from this reporter was to find out how often are tasers used in our community? Who are they used against? Age groups, sexes. I want to know, are pregnant women getting tased? Is that on the table? Are elderly people being tased? Are students, children being tased? If so, are there any differentiations between the amount of a shock that a person can take, whether they're an adult, an elderly person, a woman, a man, etc.? I want to know the details about whether or not there is some kind of documentation of every time someone is shot with a taser, and who can view that information. And I want to know if there's any lawsuits against the city or against the taser companies for the deaths or injuries. I couldn't get any of that. Not from my reporter, not from the local police, because the police would not answer any of those questions, and none of my reporters felt courageous enough to push back. They were literally afraid of asking the police those questions. And over the time that I was editor of that paper, and since then, the police have closed ranks. Politicians have closed ranks. There was a time in our history when you could walk into any town hall and you could walk up into any political person's face, whether they were door knocking or at a public event, and you could ask them a question without getting tackled by the police, without being tased, without being carried out. And there was a time in this country when a local person, whether you were a journalist or not, could go to your local authorities, could stand in front of your mayor, could go to a local person that, ran something and ask a question, whether it was a county commission meeting, city council meeting, or school board meeting. Today, they limit how many number of minutes you can talk. There was a time when if police were out doing their business, you could film them, you could, report on what was going on, you could ask them questions, you could expect there'd be a press conference where the police were gonna answer questions. You can't expect any of that today. And now, if you film the police in public, it's very likely that you're gonna be targeted for abuse, that your entire family could be targeted. And journalists feel this more keenly than anybody. So, how do you keep yourself safe? The first thing that we tried to do was hold trainings on how you can film the police safely when they're doing their jobs in public. You know what? The local police sent police to our meetings to intimidate the people that were coming to learn. Local reporters, local radio show personalities talked about how the police didn't just attack them for filming them in public or trying to report on what they were doing, but actually tased them, jailed them, took their audio, video recordings and destroyed them. And that's just here in Fargo, Moorhead. So how do you, as a local, how does anybody that wants to go into journalism stay safe? Well, it's a very dangerous landscape because, as Nico mentioned, you're going to have guns pointed at you. You're going to have the mainstream media, the local law enforcement, which work hand in glove. There's a reason why that there's only the press release that the police gave verbatim about what happened to George Floyd in the news. There's only the narrative of the police in the news because they work hand in glove with the mainstream media. And if the mainstream media doesn't play ball, they don't get any more reports from the police. If you don't play with the police or with the local authorities, you as a mainstream media person are not accepted. So, it's a very rough road. To answer your question, you have to be very public. You have to make sure that all of your reporters are, protected through the local coverage and support of the community. You have to have a platform that is certified, licensed, that has national visibility, and then you have to go to your local elected leaders and members of Congress, and you have to find support for your journalists if something were to happen to them. Because you know that by putting them out on the ground, you're putting their lives in danger. What are you going to do when they get arrested? What are you going to do when their equipment is confiscated or destroyed because they went to cover the riot on January 6th? What are you going to do? And if you don't have a backup plan to protect all of your journalists, if you don't have a politician, local, state, and federal, in your corner, ready to speak out about the abuses of any authorities against journalism, then you're not going to be prepared for when that happens.
Question for you, Cindy. So we're going to go to Nemo and then Sabrina with a couple of questions. Nemo first. We've mentioned earlier this idea of media being created by centralized old white guys, right, to summarize it, right? Now, you've done some really incredible things for queer programmers and queer storytelling. And I wonder if you can expand a little bit on why it's important for those stories to be shared by individuals in the queer community and what it means to members of the queer community to hear stories from other queer people.
Well, it started first when I started the program Finding Me on the radio, and I started talking about the issues that were important to me, like how one of the major issues a couple of years back was the constant discourse of police at pride. And one of the things that we want to emphasize, especially as queer people of color, is that they can leave their badges, at the door, and if you are a queer officer, then come as a queer person, because that's who you are, but you can leave your badge at the door. We can't take off our skin for being brown, and we're not going to stop being ourselves for being queer. So if that's how you want to be part of the community, you need to do it in this way because of the painful history and trauma in regards to police interaction with queer people and queer people of color, and how that manifests historically up until Stonewall. So that was one of the major issues I wanted to talk about in my radio program, and what people ought to do to protect themselves and to be wary of when interacting with police in relation to the training at PPP about interacting with police in a way that keeps everybody safe and allows officers to do their job, and for people who are at Pride or other events to remain safe. Other issues I discussed were things like Pink at Pride, where people were trying to understand, like, I can't bring my kids because the people are wearing pink gear. It's like, well, there is children-centered events at Pride. You don't need to bring them to the 18-plus events that is clearly labeled on the program. So I don't know how you got lost. We can escort you to the correct place. So when people like make these this false argument here, it takes us nowhere, and it kind of brings us back to the old stereotype of the gay pedophile, which obviously is harmful. So, I just bring up all of these things where, okay, queer people out there in the community, you're going to hear this, you're going to hear that. Don't listen to them. It's a trick. I've seen it before. As an anthropologist, I see the history, I see the patterns, and I'm telling you right now, this will happen in this order, and you can circumvent that by knowing what the truth is, and then making sure you have that as your shield so that you can protect yourself, you can protect your friends and your family that you have. So that's how I was informing people at first. And then, when I felt I had said what I wanted to say to the people in my community, I wanted to expand that to my main passion, which is art and animation, and seeing queer people portrayed in a way that, we want to be seen. We want to be desirable to, as human beings in our community. We want to be able to work with people. We want to be able to see our lives portrayed on screen in a way that represents us. We want to see more than just the queer villain. We want to see the queer heroes as well. We don't want to just limit it to one scope of our identity or anything like that. And so I have started this mission where I took a show that a lot of queer people are connected to, and as a foundation, we're creating a fan animation where I have many writers, some of who are queer and some of who are people of color, write a different version of that story. Like, what if it ends like this instead of like that, where it feels like everybody got distant and the storyline kind of ends with, hey, that one gay character that came out in the previous season, well, now they're isolated from their friends and family. Like, what does that tell the audience? That if I come out as gay, that all my friends and family will leave me? That doesn't really help the queer person that's watching the show. So we wanted to rewrite it in a way that shows how now, because this person is out to their friends and family, that they're even a stronger unit because they have a more full picture of who this person is to them. And so now, without the secrets, they become a stronger team, and they go out and defeat the villain, right? So that is the goal, is that I want to have, be able to tell people that you can rewrite the story, or you can make your own story that you're not otherwise seeing in the media right now in terms of cartoons or filmmaking and storytelling, whether it's through podcasts, animation, art, through comics, etc. So that's how I plan to expand representation.
I'm going to ask Sabrina my next question. It's the last question for you because it's kind of a large question. Because you have really built something pretty unique in the state of North Dakota. It's a 24-hour radio station that is home to underheard voices from a number of different communities: queer, Latino, Somali. There's, I think I've heard Cuban music. I mean, you were doing live feeds from Standing Rock when they were installing the pipeline. So my question to you is how did you envision that creation of this product that could be here in Fargo and service all of these communities? And what have you learned that might be a catalyst for other organizations to emulate or continue to create these spaces for these marginalized voices?
Well, thank you very much for that question. That's really important because it's a calling for everybody to join and work together to proliferate media going forward. We're in a new paradigm, right? We're in the modern day. The future is now, and TikTok is here, right? And so we have to figure out how do we catch up to what's already being done in the media. When I was growing up in Muscatine, Iowa, I didn't buy the newspaper. My family didn't. No Mexicans bought the newspaper or really watched the local media because they didn't talk about us unless they were putting us on a mugshot, unless they were saying something negative about my community. The one time my father was on the cover of the Muscatine Journal was when there was an 8-point earthquake in Mexico in 1985. And thousands of people died, so they came to ask a Mexican about the death, right? But otherwise, we were not in the media. I worked really hard back home to try to get the local newspaper to do a Spanish version of the newspaper, which they eventually did, only on Sundays. And then radio. And then trying to get stories that weren't about the ghetto, that weren't about some Mexican cultural event, because that's all we are. We're just a Cinco de Mayo. We're just, a gang-related shooting at the school. We're not looked at for our excellence or for anything else having to do with our regular lives. So we're stereotyped, and so are many other Black, Indigenous, people of color groups in this country. And how people interact with media or how people see the media also has a lot to do with how they consume media. When I was doing media trainings, when we first started our nonprofit to do radio work, I went out to the universities, I went out to the colleges, and I asked people all the time how many times they had been in the paper, how many times they had been the subject of a story or been in a story that they had to interact with a journalist or a media, national or local, didn't matter. Very few hands went up. Very few people had any contact with the media. And let's face it, the reality, especially for marginalized voices, if you're a person that has a disability, if you are a person that is queer, if you are a person that is elderly, if you are a person that is non-white, if you are a person that is non-male, there's a large chance that you're going to be interviewed by somebody that doesn't care about you, that doesn't know anything about you, and that really doesn't care what the outcome of this story is going to do to your family or to you. They don't care. They're not going to do a follow-up. We're never going to see you again. You are literally clickbait for a lot of media. And whether or not it's intentional, media has a responsibility to the people that they're covering. So when you do a cursory story about a shooting or about a bullying at the school or about anything that has to do with a marginalized person, and you do not humanize that person, you do not give enough time to that story so that it isn't just swept under the rug, or so those people aren't targeted by local law enforcement and other authorities, then you are actually doing a disservice in journalism. You are harming the community that you are covering. And a lot of people in their first experience of getting covered in a story are harmed in such a way that they never want to interact with another journalist again. Because that story put a target on their back, ridiculed them, shamed their community, made them look and feel stupid. So they never want to talk to another journalist. So one of the things that I have learned is that we don't have enough interaction and training with the community about how to interact with the media. Nobody ever tells you about what the ramifications of talking to the media are going to be for yourself or for your community. And that's something that we need to do. We also need to prepare people to tell their own stories, because by and large, what I have found as a person of color in media is that I'm usually the only person of color there, the only woman there, the only Mexican there, you know? And what that means is that we need to teach each other, we need to be capable of telling our own stories, because when we let other people do it for us, they usually get it wrong.
2020 was like a turning point, especially for me. Like, you know, growing up, I always wanted to be an animator of some sort, work in the animation industry. But I felt so unachievable because I was disabled. It would involve having to move either to the East Coast or the West Coast, both expensive places to live in. And on top of that, they often demand that you like live nearby so that you can come into the studio and do this and that and the other thing. And then on top of that, the job is kind of moving here and there, everywhere, wherever you're needed, depending on what studio decides to hire you for a year or a few years. And then once the show is over, you gotta go to the next one, you know, get your next gig. But because the pandemic hit, everyone was trying to work at home. And we're seeing all these ads because now actors can't, like, you know, be on set anymore for the commercials for their movies. And so I'm seeing a lot more animated segments in commercials and movies. And so it's like, so this whole time, animators could have been working from home with the programs that they have or are given to them by the studios, and we could have been doing this the whole time. Voice actors were doing stuff in their home studios, or were getting equipment for their home studios, and writers were just writing from home, and then you have Zoom meetings, and then, you know, so on and so forth. So like literally the whole time, this job could have been accessible for disabled individuals, could have been accessible for people who did not have the financial means to move to these cities and towns and everything. And so for me, it was just like, literally I can have anyone around the world, and I do. I have people in Ireland, I have people in England, and where else? Peru, yeah, I have people in Peru, and in Mexico, and California, and Australia, Canada. I have all sorts of people that are volunteering because we have this passion for a show that ended now like 5 more years ago, and we're still working on it to make it something that we wanted to feel represented in, but we're not represented. So, you know, the sky's the limit now, where nobody has to leave the safety of their home in an ongoing pandemic, and literally, like, this should be how it should be, where it's accessible for anyone.
For me, it was the proof of concept of what a small media platform, independent media platform can do. Every hurdle that I had come up against from the time that I had any contact with media as a child to the time when I was working in media as a columnist or writer for my brother's newspaper, I knew that there were barriers to entry for women, for people of color in journalism, because the mainstream media doesn't want independent journalists, because the local authorities have deals with the people that are in mainstream media and they don't want you to be in their way, and all the other things that we had to deal with, including being a drop in the bucket as a new media platform that was up against everybody else, including national media. And when I was able to show, with the case of Kathleen Bennett from the Dakota Access Pipeline, that we could, using our little tiny radio station, shine a spotlight on an injustice done to an Indigenous woman and her family, that we could find justice for that family, liberate a woman that spent 6 months in jail, accused of abusing her elderly mother and abandoning her at the camp, leaving her shackled to a chair, naked, covered in her own excrement and urine, none of which was true, by the way. In an effort to demonize indigenous people at that camp and to criminalize an elderly woman with cognitive impairments and to permanently disband her being able to care for her elderly mother with dementia, who was put in an early grave through this process. But we were able to liberate Kathleen Bennett. The charges were all dropped. She spent 6 months in jail, but we were able to raise the bail money to get her out. And in addition to that, we were able to get all of her charges dropped, so she was completely exonerated. And even though her mother did die, she was able to be reunited and spend the last days with her mother before she passed. If you had told me that I would be able to do something like that, if I had a media platform, I probably would have spent every waking moment going through K through 12, trying to achieve that sooner in my life. And I did think that it was going to be almost impossible with the local sheriff's department, the local media, all covering what was happening at DAPL in a very skewed way. And even though there were some, really not very many other media platforms except for Unicorn Riot, that was on the ground from the very beginning, since April. Like nobody was there except for Unicorn Riot from the beginning. There wasn't, it was like you were David against Goliath. It was like, how can I possibly tell this story when everyone else is telling a different story? When people are using this story as like the poster child for why they should shut down the camps and why these indigenous people are subhuman and shouldn't be allowed to have agency for themselves. And what I realized was that our little station could focus, our superpower was that we could focus on one story and one story alone every day for a year and a half or 2 years or however long it took until that person was free. Talking about that story again and again and again and again and again until she was free.
Yay!
Yeah. And it happened! And I was like, okay, this is the proof of concept. Can a little, poorly funded station affect change and give media justice to people that usually don't find it in the court system? The answer is yes. That's what changed everything for me.
That's great. Yeah. Last question, and just because of time, 90 seconds if we're able. I'm going to ask the question, and I'll do my wrap up to give you guys all time to think about it, because it's, I don't know, it's to borrow your words, Sabrina, it's looking into the future. So, for the young filmmakers, the young media makers in the room who are going to be that long game, that long vision for this work that we're doing, what do you see as the next thing on the horizon? You're on the ground right now, you're in the middle of it. What are you seeing? It could be a philosophy, a philosophical viewpoint that's coming to focus for you. It could be technology. It could be a platform, the next TikTok. Maybe there's something that you're seeing that we should be aware of. But what is it that's next that the youth who are going to continue this work should be looking at? I'll do my wrap up and then I'll come back.
You have to control the means of production, which means you have to be on a platform in a space where you can tell your story. You have to find people that
are willing to give you some agency within your storytelling. And the mainstream is not going to do that. That's why people are going to TikTok. That's why people have their own YouTube channels. That's why people are creating their own following on Twitch. Twitch is the game, right? I'm sorry, I'm an old person. Anyway, I have to learn about these technologies. I'm on Twitch, right? I'm on Twitch. Why? Because I have the next generation in my ear telling me this is where people are talking. This is where people are going. And we have to go there with them. We have to catch up to them. And the reason they're going there, for however long it remains this way, is because they have more autonomy, because they can tell their stories and it will stay up for a few days before it gets mass reported for violating community standards and is censored.
Yes.
Right? And so those are the spaces where people still have a voice. Hence why I created a platform where people can come on my radio station if they want to create a program, if they want to talk about these issues. They have carte blanche. They have an open invitation to come and talk about what they want to talk about, how they want to talk about it, without being censored. I'm the boss. So nobody's going to come and remove your content. Nobody's going to tell you what you can and cannot say. And nobody's going to attack you after you leave. And creating those spaces and finding and funding those spaces in your local communities is very important. I rely on grant funding and sponsorships and, individuals that support our community, but I have to rely on nothing. I have to be able to sustain myself without a cent, because the reality is that most independent journalists are going to be strangled in their sleep. They're going to be destroyed by all of the other mainstream that doesn't want them around, that doesn't want them as competition, right? So they don't want for you to succeed, and they're going to try to extinguish any funding sources and any way of proliferating what you're doing. You have to make sure that those independent media sources remain available for your community by funding them, by supporting them, by sharing them, whatever you can do. Whether it's Unicorn Riot, whether it's your local monthly or weekly newspaper, those may be the only places, the vestiges left of your free speech. Maybe you're not a journalist, but you should know one, a local one, an independent one, someone that you can rely on to tell your story without being afraid and embarrassed and targeted afterwards. So my advice to journalists, to media creators, to filmmakers, especially those that want to highlight human rights abuses in our country, of which there are a plethora. So much corruption, so many abuses that never get discussed in our mainstream media. And locally, what that means is by you existing, you change the paradigm for everybody else. When we started covering the story of bullying and abuses of BIPOC children in our local schools, I had local news media people, my peers, calling me and saying, "Cindy, why did you do that? Why did you post the social media pictures, comments, racial slurs, gay slurs that these high school students made on Facebook? Why did you put that in your media? Why did you let that become public? These are minors. We have to protect their identities." Yes, they invited a hate group to our town to attack gay people, to hurt people of color, but that doesn't mean that you should ruin their future. Don't you care about these white children, Cindy? Why are you doing something that nobody else in the local media will do? And I said, do you care the same way about BIPOC children, about BIPOC people who are slurred and whose reputations are slandered and destroyed in the media when they are the victims of police corruption and abuse of authority. When they are the victims of bullying in the schools, do you care about the way that the media destroys the reputation of them and their families? The same way that you care about the reputation of these kids? They were like, huh, it's an interesting point. And guess what? Because of what we did, because of what we have shown, we've made it clear that if you have a problem with reporting bullying, mistreatment of gay students, mistreatment of disabled students in the schools, and nobody in the local media will cover it, you can come to KPPP-FM radio, and we will tell that story. If you're a BIPOC person, if you're an indigenous person, if you're a black person, and there was police abuse against you, and no one else will dare to touch that story, KPPP-FM will cover that story.
Excuse me, say that name again, KP, what is that?
KPPP-FM.
KP,
3 P's.
KPP-FM.
3 P's.
Okay, got it, FM
88.1 FM. We will cover those stories.
8.1.
And you know what? Local media
Okay, thank you.
have come after us after we've covered a story
Sure.
and said, hey, we need you to give us access to that family. We need to talk to that kid, and we need to put them on our station, a station that we know
Good.
has been criticized for the way that they portray stories about people of color.
Wow.
And I said, sorry, I lost their number. Can't help you. Not gonna give you the opportunity to go and defame these poor people and their family. So by being that person in the community, by being that local reporter, by being that guerrilla journalist, you are setting the standard. You are setting the bar for how media works in your community.
What I see in the horizon for the future in terms of animation is something I'm already seeing now, within like the last 5-10 years or so. 9 years ago, one of my favorite children's programs, Steven Universe, aired. And I started watching it because it started getting hyped up, and I was like, what is up with this kid show that everybody's talking about? Because like, at the time, I'm like 24, 25 years old or something, or, you know, I'm starting college, right? And so I watch it, and then I get into it, and I see the queer representation, the discussion of mental health, in ways that I did not expect for a 7 and older children's show to be expressed in a way and portrayed in this way that like borders on the edge of like adult themed in terms of discussion of mental health, but is still tangible in a way for young audiences to understand. And so by watching this show, I was like, Mom, you have to watch this show. I know you don't like watching cartoons, but you have to watch this one, this show, because it's changing my life right now, and I need you to understand where I'm coming from. And so when I see shows like that, it inspires me to make my own work, to talk to children and to talk to their parents, because kids, you know, they're going to talk about their Barney, they're going to talk about their Powerpuff Girls, they're going to talk about SpongeBob, and they're going to talk about that to their parents and what these messages that they're getting. And I want to create something similar to things like Steven Universe or other cool shows that talk about queer identities, mental health, racism that kids experience all the time, because that's not talked about very often between BIPOC kids and their white peers. And like, how can their white peers start to empathize with their BIPOC peers? How can they find a way to be better allies that their parents are otherwise not educating them on because they're too scared to talk about racism? You know, when Steven Universe was airing, they had a PSA about racism using one of the characters. And the white child in this cartoon was like, how is this even real? And it's like, it happens all the time. Just because it doesn't happen to you, it doesn't mean it's not happening at all. And you need to start talking to your peers so that you can start to understand that and know when to recognize it so you can put a stop to it. And that's what I want to be able to tell kids. Like, we can work together to like look out for the real evil out there in the world. Something that you can recognize that is beyond, you know, the magic of the show that you're watching. And when kids learn that, they talk about it with their parents, and it's done in a way that maybe the parent can learn too. and start to change their own ways about how they view the world.